I'm delighted to be here. I have many friends on the faculty and in the administration. Columbia is a great institution, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk to you about these issues. So let me begin with a little bit of history to put things in context. Academic freedom is not a law of nature. It is not something to be taken for granted. It is rather a hard-bought acquisition in a centuries-long struggle for academic integrity. Indeed, until well into the 19th century, real freedom of thought was neither practiced nor professed in American colleges and universities. To the contrary, any real freedom of inquiry or expression in American colleges in the first part of the 19th century was smothered by the dominance of religion and by the prevailing theory of doctrinal moralism, which assumed that the worth of an idea must be judged by what the institution's leaders thought its moral value to be. And any idea put forth that was not consistent with that judgment was forbidden. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, American colleges were deeply centered in tradition. They looked at antiquity for the tools of thought and to Christianity for the laws of living. They were highly paternalistic and authoritarian. Education focused on mechanical drill and on rigid discipline. It squelched any notion of free discussion or of intellectual curiosity. Any student or faculty member who argued, for example, that fornication should be legal, that homosexuality is not immoral, that women are equal to men, that blacks are equal to white, or that there might not be a just and all-powerful God who created man in his image, would surely be expelled or fired without hesitation from most institutions. Similarly, through the first half of the 19th century, as the nation moved towards the Civil War, any professor or student in the North who defended slavery, or any professor or student in the South who challenged slavery, could readily be dismissed, disciplined, or expelled. When a professor at the University of North Carolina expressed sympathy for the 1856 Republican presidential candidate, for example, students burned him in effigy, and he was dismissed by the Board of Trustees. When a professor at Franklin College in Pennsylvania admitted that he was not an abolitionist, he was promptly fired by the institution. Between 1870 and 1900, though, there was a genuine revolution in American higher education. With the battle over Darwinism, new academic goals came for the first time to be embraced. For the first time, to criticize as well as to preserve traditional moral values and understandings became an accepted function of higher education. And indeed, by 1892, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, could boldly assert, quote, "When for any reason the administration of the university attempts to dislodge a professor or punish a student because of his political or religious sentiments, at that moment the institution has ceased to be a university." But despite such bold sentiments, the battle for academic freedom has been a contentious and a continuing one. In the closing years of the 19th century, businessmen who had accumulated vast industrial wealth began to support universities for the first time on an unprecedented scale. But that support was not without strings. And during this era, professors who offended wealthy trustees by challenging the ethics of their business practices were routinely dismissed from such leading universities as Cornell and Stanford because they criticized the practices and policies of big business and big donors. Then during World War I, when patriotic zealots persecuted and even prosecuted those who questioned the wisdom and morality of the war or the draft, universities collapsed almost completely in their defense of academic freedom. Students and professors were systematically expelled or fired at such institutions as Columbia and Virginia, merely for encouraging a spirit of indifference towards the war. Similar issues arose again with a vengeance during the age of McCarthy. In the late 1940s and 1950s, most universities excluded those even suspected of entertaining communist sympathies from university life. Yale President Charles Seymour went so far as to boast, for example, that, quote, "There will be no witch hunts at Yale because there will be no witches. We will neither admit nor hire nor tolerate anyone with communist sympathies." As history demonstrates, the real threat to academic freedom comes from efforts to impose a pall of orthodoxy that is designed to silence opposition. History also demonstrates that every form of orthodoxy that has been imposed on the academy, whether religious, political, patriotic, scientific, moral, philosophical, or economic, has been imposed by groups who were fully and completely and unquestionably convinced of the rightness of their position. And it is equally clear that with the benefit of hindsight and some objectivity, that every one of these groups has later come to be viewed by most thoughtful people as having been inappropriately intolerant and destructive of the true mission of the American university. We now face a similar set of challenges. We live today in an era of political correctness in which students themselves demand censorship, and colleges and universities, afraid to offend their students, too often surrender academic freedom to charges of offense. To give just a few, or not such a few, examples, several colleges and universities, including Brown, Johns Hopkins, and Williams, have recently withdrawn speaker invitations because of student objections to the views of the invited speakers. Northwestern University recently subjected a professor to a sustained sexual harassment investigation for publishing an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education that criticized Northwestern University's sexual harassment investigations. Brandeis University ruled that a professor's classes would henceforth have to be monitored because in one class he explained that Mexican immigrants to the United States are sometimes referred to as wetbacks, to the outrage of his Mexican-American students. After a faculty member at Oberlin College made several social media posts that were considered by some to be anti-Semitic, and Oberlin's president, who by the way himself is Jewish, defended her right to free expression, Oberlin's Board of Trustees demanded that the college reconsider its protection of such expression. At the University of Kansas, students demanded the termination of a professor for using the word nigger in class during a discussion of campus racism. Colorado College suspended a student for making a joke that mocked feminism. The State University of New York denied promotion to a professor who criticized the university's affirmative action program. William and Mary, DePaul, and the University of California, Irvine all disciplined students for criticizing their affirmative action programs. Students at Vanderbilt demanded that a tenured professor should be fired for writing an op-ed in which he raised questions about the relationship between Islam and violence. The University of Kansas disciplined a professor for mocking the National Rifle Association. Louisiana State University fired a professor after nearly 2 decades of service because some of her women students complained that they'd been made to feel uncomfortable by her use of profanity in class. At my own institution, the University of Chicago, a group of community activists from Black Lives Matter movement, joined by several students, disrupted an event at which the Cook County State's Attorney was speaking, with the result that the event had to be terminated. At Wesleyan University, after the school newspaper published a student op-ed criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement, a group of students demanded that the university defund the student paper. At Amherst, students demanded that the administration remove posters stating all lives matter. At Emory University, several dozen students demanded that those who had chalked Trump in 2016 on the university's sidewalks should be punished because, in their words, a university is supposed to be a safe place for students, and this made us feel unsafe. And at Harvard Law School, a professor was taken to the woodshed for offending African American students by saying in class that he would be lynched if he gave a closed book exam. The latter, by the way, is an example of so-called microaggressions. That is, words or phrases that may make students feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Saying off the reservation has been deemed a microaggression to Native Americans. Saying America is a melting pot has been deemed a microaggression to new immigrants. And saying, as a woman, I know what you must go through as a racial minority has been deemed a microaggression to racial minorities. Such microaggressions, whether used by faculty or students, have been deemed punishable by several colleges and universities across the nation. A recent survey revealed that 72% of current college students support disciplinary action against any student or faculty member who expresses views that they deem racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. And a Pew survey recently found that 40% of all millennials now believe that government should punish individuals for making statements that offend members of minority groups. Another recent invention is the trigger warning. A trigger warning is the requirement that before professors assign readings or hold classes that might make some students feel uncomfortable or unsafe, they must warn students in advance that the readings of the class will deal with such sensitive topics as rape, affirmative action, abortion, murder, slavery, the Holocaust, religion, homosexuality, or immigration, or might include such dramatic words as nigger, tyke, or fag. The idea is that students who would be upset can then avoid having to deal with such emotionally upsetting material. Here at Columbia, for example, students apparently demanded trigger warnings before a professor could teach Ovid's Metamorphosis, because it includes a description of sexual assault. So where did all of this come from? It was not too long ago when college students were demanding the right to freedom of speech. Now, they increasingly demand the right to be free from speech, or at least speech that they find offensive, upsetting, or emotionally fraught. The current phenomenon is based on the assumption that students should not be made to feel uncomfortable or unsafe. One oft-expressed explanation of this phenomenon is that this has happened because students of this generation, unlike their predecessors, are weak, fragile, and emotionally unstable. The explanation is that this generation of young adults has often been raised by so-called helicopter parents who have protected, rewarded, shielded, and celebrated them in every way from the time they were infants. They have never learned to deal with challenge, uncertainty, anxiety, stress, defeat, insult, or fear. On this view, this generation of college students is, in fact, emotionally incapable of dealing with this kind of discomfort and challenge. But if that is so, then I would argue that the proper role of university is not to protect and pamper the students, but to prepare them for the challenges of dealing with the realities of the real world. The goal should not be to shield them from discomfort, insult, and insecurity, but to enable them to become effective citizens in the world, a world which will not protect them from such discomfort. On this view, if their parents have indeed failed them in this way, then colleges and universities should save them from themselves. Now, there's another possible explanation as well, and it's that students, or at least some students, have always felt this way. But until now, they were too intimidated, or too shy, or too deferential to speak up. On this view of the matter, this generation of college students deserves credit, because instead of remaining silent and oppressed and intimidated, they have the courage to demand respect, equality, and safety. My own view, for what it's worth, is that there is an element of truth in both of these perspectives, but I'm inclined to think that the former view explains more of the current reality than the latter. In any event, faced with the ongoing challenge to academic freedom at American universities, University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer charged a faculty committee last year with the task of drafting a formal statement for the university on the subject of free expression, as Professor Hamburger pointed out. The goal of that committee, which I chaired, was to stake out the University of Chicago's position on these issues. The committee consisted of 7 very distinguished faculty members from across the institution, and in undertaking the task, the committee consulted with students, with faculty, with administrators in Chicago, with current and former presidents and provosts at other institutions, and with several national institutions, such as the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and the American Association of University Professors. In the end, we produced a brief 3-page report. At the risk of being self-indulgent, I want to read you some key sections of the report to give you a sense of both what the University of Chicago says about these issues and also my own views as well, since the report reflects them. So, quote, "From its founding, the university has dedicated itself to the preservation and celebration of the freedom of expression as an essential element of the university's culture. Because the university is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees all members of the university community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. Except insofar as limitations on that freedom are necessary to the functioning of the University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of the community to discuss any problem that presents itself. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions that they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas might be to some members of the community. The freedom to debate and to discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, wherever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment of specific individuals, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the core functioning of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression, and it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment to the principle that robust debate and deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission. As a corollary to the university's commitment to protect and promote free expression, members of the university community must also act in conformity with the principle of free expression. Although members of the university are free to criticize and contest the views expressed on campus, and to criticize and contest speakers who are invited to express their views on campus, they may not obstruct or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views that they reject or loathe. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. As University of Chicago President William Rainey Harper observed 125 years ago, without a vibrant commitment to free and open inquiry, a university ceases to be a university. End quote. Now, interestingly, when we wrote this report, we were thinking only about the University of Chicago. It was a report for us, about us, and indeed the first 5 paragraphs all talk about the history of the university to explain the traditions that we're invoking. It was therefore to our considerable surprise that the report turned out to have a national and indeed even international impact. Indeed, the report at this point has been adopted by a number of other institutions, including Princeton, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, American University, the University of Wisconsin, Louisiana State University, and a number of others, and is currently under consideration by dozens of other institutions, both here and abroad. What they figured out, which we never anticipated, was that they could simply lop off the first 5 paragraphs, which talk all about Chicago, and then just adopt the remaining 7 or 8 paragraphs, which talk about the issues without any reference to the university as a distinct institution. And I'm needless to say delighted that that has occurred and is continuing to occur. Okay, but now that I've finished congratulating myself, let me elaborate a bit. So first, why should a university take the position that members of the university community should be free to advance any and all ideas, however offensive, obnoxious, and wrong-headed they may be? So first, one thing we've learned from bitter experience is that even the ideas we hold to be most certain might in fact turn out to be wrong. As certain as we might be in our own wisdom, experience teaches that certainty is different from truth. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said about the First Amendment almost a century ago, the temptation to suppress offensive opinions is perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises or your power and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally sweep away all opposition. But he said, when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe more than they believe even in the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by the free trade in ideas, and that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. If those who believed to an absolute certainty that the earth was the center of the universe were wrong, if those who believed with absolute certainty in creationism were wrong, if those who believed that slavery was natural, right, and proper were wrong, if those who believed that a woman's place is in the home were wrong, if those who believed that gays and lesbians were moral degenerates were wrong, if those who believed that criticism of war was prohibitable sedition was wrong, then why should we have the arrogance to think with certainty that we are right? The only wise approach, as Holmes said, is to acknowledge the risk that our certainties might be wrong as well, and that they must therefore always be open to challenge and question and testing. This is true not only for democracy, but also and perhaps especially for a university. Second, history teaches that suppression of speech breeds and invites suppression of speech. If today I am permitted to silence those whose views that I find hateful, I then open the door to allow others down the road to silence me. The neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. Those who today would silence those who offend them invite retaliation in the future. The principle of censorship inevitably invites censorship. And this, by the way, is especially dangerous in the current academic climate. For those who argue most vehemently for censorship today are members of minority groups, whose own vulnerability to being silenced in the future is much greater than they might imagine. In a world of Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, in a world of ISIS and the NRA, in a world with racism and sexism and homophobia and hatred of immigrants and Muslims and abortion, this is a door that we should not want to open. Third, a central precept of free expression is the concern with chilling effect. That is, the tendency of individuals to forego their own expression because of the risk that if they speak openly, that they might later be disadvantaged for having taken the position they take. This is a special concern in the realm of free expression, because it's almost always the case that Joe knows that if he marches in a parade or signs a petition or likes a post online, that nothing of consequence is likely to follow. That is, he knows that his own voice in itself will not likely change the world, will not likely make a difference one way or the other on the issues about which he speaks. But if Joe knows that expressing his views in these ways might subject him now or in the future to a serious disadvantage, ranging from losing friends to not getting a job to not being able to run from public office, then he will exercise caution and will be inclined to remain silent. This is what we mean by chilling effect. The problem from the standpoint of free speech is that it probably doesn't matter much if Joe chooses to remain silent, given that his own voice, standing alone, probably won't change anything. But if lots of Joes with similar views all choose to remain silent, then the marketplace of ideas is seriously corrupted and debate is skewed. If everyone critical of a war is chilled into silence because of the fear of the consequences of taking that view, then criticism of the war disappears from public discourse. If everyone who supports the right of abortion is chilled into silence because of the fear of the consequences of taking that view, or if everyone who supports gun control is chilled into silence because of the fear of the consequences, then our academic discourse, our search for truth, and our democracy are all in peril. This problem is especially acute today because of the effects of social media. It used to be the case that a student or faculty member was willing to take risks by saying controversial things because the risks were relatively modest. After all, one could say something provocative in a discussion or in a classroom or in a debate, and the statement soon disappeared from view. It was there for the moment, people talked about it, and then life went on. But in a world of social media, where every comment a student or faculty member makes can be circulated to the world at large and be called up by prospective employers or graduate schools or neighbors or voters with the click of a button, then the potential cost of speaking courageously, of taking controversial positions, of taking risks, is greater than ever before in history. Indeed, according to a recent survey, 65% of all college students today say that it is unsafe for them to express unpopular views. And this clearly has an effect on faculty, I have to say as well. In this setting, it is especially important for universities to stand up for free expression. So how should all this work in practice? So should students be allowed to express whatever views they want, however offensive they might be to others, whether about abortion or affirmative action or homosexuality or immigration or Donald Trump or whatever? Yes, absolutely. Should they be allowed to express their views in ways that are insulting or offensive or disturbing to others? Yes. As the Supreme Court has long recognized in its interpretation of the First Amendment, it is often the case that the most effective way to express the depths of one's beliefs and to get attention for one's views is to offend. As the court famously held, fuck the draft is quite different from I don't like the draft. And one way to convey the depth of one's convictions, the depth of one's emotions, is to dare to be offensive. Should those who disagree and who are offended by the views and speech of others be allowed to condemn that speech and those speakers in the most vehement terms? Yes, absolutely. Should those who are offended and who disagree be allowed to demand that the university should punish those who have offended them? Yes, absolutely. Should the university punish those whose speech annoys, offends, and insults others? Absolutely not. That is the core meaning of academic freedom. So what should a university do if it's not going to censor? Well, for one thing, it should certainly educate our students and our faculty about civility and about mutual respect as appropriate things for them to learn and to value, although they're free to reject that, as they are anything we teach. But as good citizens, as good members of our community, that's something universities should feel comfortable and feel a responsibility to promote. At the same time, they should encourage fierce disagreement, argument, and debate, and encourage students and faculty members not to be chilled by a fear of opposition or of consequences. The bottom line is this: for a university to fulfill its most fundamental mission, it must be a safe space for even the most odious, offensive, and disloyal arguments. Students should be encouraged to be tough, fearless, rigorous, and effective advocates and critics. Now, at the same time, a university has to recognize that our society, being flawed as it is, the cost of free speech will often fall most heavily on those groups who feel the most marginalized, unwelcome, and disrespected. All of us, of course, feel that way sometimes, but in our flawed society, the individuals in universities who most often bear the brunt these days of free speech, at least of certain types of free speech, tend to be racial minorities, religious minorities, women, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, immigrants, political conservatives, religious conservatives, and the like. Universities have to be conscious of this reality. Even if they cannot solve this problem by censorship, this does not mean they can't take other steps to help address the special challenges faced by groups and individuals who are most often made to feel unwelcome, unvalued, and to be intimidated by such expression. Universities should take this challenge seriously. They should support students who feel vulnerable and marginalized. They should help those students learn how to speak up, how to respond effectively, how to challenge those whose attitudes, whose words, and whose beliefs appall and outrage them. This is indeed a core responsibility of universities. For the world is not a safe space, and it is not our job as educators to enable, and it is our job as educators to enable our students to win the battles that they will need to fight in the years and decades to come. And this is not a challenge universities should ignore. Now, as a law professor, let me throw out a number of hypotheticals for you to consider, because stating a principle, like the Chicago Statement, may be easy to do, but it's much more difficult to apply that principle to concrete situations. And I'll just build those out for us to discuss now or for you to discuss later. So first, suppose a professor gives a talk on campus arguing that affirmative action is immoral because it puts its intended beneficiaries into an academic environment for which they are unprepared. Minority students are furious because they say the talk demeans them and in their view is blatantly racist. Question is, what should the president of the university do faced with those complaints? Second, suppose a student group invites an outside speaker to campus to advocate the position that abortion is murder, that homosexuals are moral degenerates, or that the nation should close its borders to Muslim immigrants. In the face of student and alumni protests, should the president cancel such a speech? Third, suppose a faculty member uses the word fuck in class, or the word slut, or the word nigger, and students are upset and furious. As the dean of the relevant part of the institution, what should the dean do? In what circumstances should the faculty member be prohibited from using such words, if any? Fourth, suppose a student hangs a Confederate flag or an image of an aborted fetus or a vote for Trump sign on the door of her dorm room. Should the resident head order her to take it down? Fifth, suppose John, the vice president for development at the university, goes on Fox News and says on national television, abortion is murder. We should fire any woman faculty member and expel any student who has an abortion. The president of the university is then inundated with complaints from alumni, saying, in effect, I'll never give another nickel to your damn school again as long as John is in charge of the development office. What should the president do? Sixth, suppose a prospective student or a prospective faculty member writes an op-ed in a newspaper saying that Israel is a hateful nation that should be bombed out of existence, or that women invariably lie when they file claims of sexual assault. Should the university take those statements into account in deciding whether to admit the student or to hire the prospective faculty member? Seventh, suppose a student group invites a speaker who will argue that the police are justified in using violence against suspects in high-crime neighborhoods, and the members of the university's Black Lives Matter student organization then disrupts the program by standing up during the event and chanting Black Lives Matter to the point when the student organization effectively has to end the event. Should the university suspend the students who disrupted the event, or were they exercising their right to free speech? Finally, suppose a law professor teaches criminal law, and one of the cases to be discussed involves a brutal rape. Should he show a video of the rape in class? Suppose he knows that one of the students in the class was raped several years ago. Should he warn the student not to attend? If he does show the video and doesn't warn the student, should the faculty member be disciplined for not giving a trigger warning? Okay, that's enough of that for now. Let me end here and invite some discussion. Thank you. But only discussion if you agree with me.
If you have questions, put up your hand. I'm going to hand you a mic.
Hi. First, thank you so much for coming. I have a question about your last hypothetical and the point that you brought up when you were mentioning sort of the issues that have arisen among universities over the last few years, but that didn't seem to be particularly addressed in the rest of your speech and in the University of Chicago's statement, which is the issue of trigger warnings. And I guess in particular my question is, if I understand trigger warnings correctly, it's just a warning to say, this is what we're going to be discussing, make your own decision about whether you can handle that. What's the harm in having that be a universal policy to say, we're going to watch a video about rape today. If you don't want to come, you don't have to come.
Right. So, first of all, my position on that is that a faculty member, if he or she wishes to give a trigger warning, is free to do that as part of academic freedom. But that a university, in my view, should not require a faculty member to give trigger warnings, because I think that decision belongs to the faculty member. So why wouldn't one give trigger warnings? Okay, so I can think of at least two reasons. The first is that it affirms the notion that students are incapable of addressing these issues, even if it upsets them. And I'm not sure that's a message I would want to send as a teacher. That's number one. Second is that it's an incredibly complicated slippery slope. That once you open the door to this, then the complaints that you will get about this upset me, that upset me, this upset me, is endless. And the problem then is, well, you make a list of 150 different things that might upset somebody, and you've got to warn everyone anytime any one of them comes up. So that would also concern me a lot. But on the other hand, if a faculty member feels that this is the best way to teach her class, I regard that as within the faculty member's discretion.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, come on, you've got to speak up.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Sure.
I was wondering where you see, if there's a point past which a university allowing a speaker, for example, that holds views that the majority of students in fact might find offensive, that allowing them amounts in some way to condoning, or maybe not endorsing those beliefs, but condoning in some way that in public view might seem like questionable judgment of the university. And I think a related piece is, can the university have a position on major issues of public policy at all? I think that I gotta say yes, of course, but how do you disaggregate that from the speech they allow on campus?
So first of all, I would not ever restrict speech because I think people outside the university would be upset with the university for doing it. Back in the 1950s, President Robert Maynard Hutchins at the University of Chicago allowed the head of the Communist Party to come and speak at the university over enormous opposition from alumni, from citizens, and so on. And he said, to be a university, we allow every view to be expressed, and we don't endorse any views, but we invite all views that students want to hear, or faculty members and students want to present. So I would not, now that's a problem. Part of the challenge is to educate the public, and particularly your own alumni and donors, that this is who we are and you should be proud of us. And that's part of the job of a university president, at least in my view. Now, I'm sorry, the second part of the question was?
Sorry, I asked in kind of disjointed way.
I'm just old.
I was asking if there's a way, if the
Oh, right,
university
you were
have
taking
policy
positions.
positions,
Okay,
and
right.
how those are expressed.
So the University of Chicago is somewhat distinctive in this respect. Back in 1967, at the height of the Vietnam War, many students, myself included at Chicago at that time, demanded that the university take a position on the war. And the university appointed a faculty committee chaired by Harry Kelvin, who was a very famous free expression scholar of that generation. And it produced the Calvin Report, which is pretty famous among university administrators, which basically took the following view: that a university must be a place in which faculty and students feel comfortable expressing any views they want. And that for the university to take positions of public policy would, in effect, diminish the sense of comfort that students and faculty would have about whether this particular view is an appropriate one for them to voice. And that therefore the university should not take any positions on matters of public policy, except in those circumstances when the public policy directly affects the university itself. So the university, for example, can take positions on getting money for financial aid for students from the federal government, or take positions on issues of anti-discrimination laws as they affect universities. But other than things that directly affect the university, all the presumptions are no. So, for example, Chicago refused to disinvest from South Africa. Very controversial, but this was the notion that this is an issue which all of us may agree on, but that doesn't matter. We don't take positions as an institution. And I think that's been a very healthy stance for the university. Among other things, it avoids the same slippery slope problem. Because once you allow yourself to take positions, then of course you have students, faculty, alumni, donors demanding that you take those positions. And you find yourself in this really dangerous position of having people say, well, you should be opposed to abortion, or you should be in favor of immigration, or you should be opposed to Donald Trump. The universities take these positions. That's not a place I think universities want to go. Jonathan?
I just want to follow up on this question because, of course, the Calvin Committee report is a very, very famous report, and I happen to love it, and it's also about 3 pages. But what I would like to ask is how you distinguish your report from the Calvin Committee report. I mean, there's a paragraph, like the 4th or 5th paragraph, which says, the mission of the university, in the Calvin Committee report, the mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. Its domain of inquiry and scrutiny includes all aspects and all values of society. The university, faithful to its mission, will provide enduring challenges to social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by effect, it's the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university like Socrates will be upsetting. So how is it that you distinguish this very fine statement, I think, from the earlier statement that became so famous in the Calvin report?
So the Calvin report was about the issue of should the university take positions. And in explaining why the university shouldn't take positions, It was saying that one of the goals of the university is to create this culture in which people feel free to express themselves without intimidation and without the notion that Big Brother is itself taking positions that will intrude on that. It did not address the question of whether the university can restrict free expression by students and faculty. And so that was this really quite different question that we were being asked to address. So the Calvin report is based upon the same presumptions about what a university is and what its goals are. But the particular policy question it was addressing was a quite different one. It was using those arguments to explain why the university shouldn't take positions. And it wasn't addressing the question of whether there are circumstances where it's appropriate for a university to tell people they can't say certain things. So that's the difference. Yes? You gotta pass the mic.
Thank
Oh,
you.
2 mics, wow. Columbia's got too much money.
Thank you. We had the example of a Columbia University student who walked about the campus carrying a mattress over her head as a sign of protest that she was sexually abused by a fellow student, and she probably thought that the university would not give her enough attention if she tried to solve it, by quiet negotiations. Would you approve of such dramatic action on the part of students?
As long as it is not physically disruptive of the normal activities of the university, sure. Approve of it, I don't care whether I approve of it or not, but I would say it's permissible. If somebody did something which obstructed the ability of students to get into classes and obstructed hallways, that would be different. But if that was not the issue, then I would think it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if 25 people or 100 people decided to do something like that at the same time, that would become obstructive, presumably. But as long as it's not obstructive physically, I don't see any reason to interfere with it.
Following up on that and taking it another step, what is the university's obligation in the face of violence or threatened violence because they know that opinions that are going to be expressed might elicit that?
So, obviously, the university's first obligation is to protect the speaker and the event from violence. One thing, again, those of you who've taken a First Amendment course know is there's a doctrine called the Hecklers Veto. And one of the great concerns in structuring a system of free expression is if you allow opponents of an idea to cause the government or the university to silence the idea because they make threats of violence if the speech is allowed to take place, then you just invite people to do this, right? And they get to use the university or the government to censor speakers by simply threatening that they're going to be violent. And so in the First Amendment context, what the court has held is that the government's obligation is to take all steps that are reasonably possible to ensure the violence doesn't occur. And but in theory, if they can't do that, if the danger is so real and present and they feel they can't control it, then they can move or cancel or delay an event. But barring a situation where it's impossible basically to avoid the violence from actually occurring, and you believe it's going to occur, then I think you have to put off the event in that circumstance. But I think that everything should be put on the avoiding that outcome, and of course punishing the people who are making the threats.
What happens when someone disrupts an ongoing event?
Well, as I meant to suggest, that was one of my
Verbal violence, isn't it?
So what?
Verbal violence.
Yeah,
isn't it?
I would say that and we said this in the report, that any person who disrupts an ongoing event with noise or in any other meaningful way that makes it difficult for the speakers and the audience to engage in the expression that they're there for can be removed and can be punished if they can't be removed, even if they can be removed. But that's, in my view, that's not part of the freedom of speech. That's disruption and obstruction and can be punished and should be punished.
I was just curious if you're concerned about the possibility of sort of the flip side, the ways that maybe potentially offensive speech can stifle the expression and speech of minority groups. You know, the example of if you're a black student at Yale who lives in the John C. Calhoun dorm, does that create the impression that you don't belong here? This place isn't meant for you, and how you should respond to that.
So, my core response is that the university should enable students who feel that way to deal with that feeling and to overcome it, and to challenge what they don't like and explain why they don't like it, and to be assertive in expressing their own feelings and views and so on, not to censor the speech. Now, there are circumstances, the John Calhoun thing is a little different, because that's not quite speech. I mean, it is speech, but it's the university's own speech by naming the building, and I don't think universities should open the door to having to denude themselves of any identifications with individuals because those individuals did something that offends somebody. Because again, like the slippery slope problem, once you go down that route, you can't, for example, ever honor, say, Bill Clinton because he signed the Defense of Marriage Act, right? And almost nobody until the last 15 or 20 years was taking strong positions protective of, say, gay rights. And so there goes everybody who's ever done anything except for the last 20 years. So I think the problem with going down the route of getting rid of Woodrow Wilson or getting rid of John Calhoun or whatever is that, again, it puts the university in the position that you have to sort of name everything after a letter of the alphabet. You know, this is B dorm, C dorm, D dorm. And you know, maybe that's okay prospectively, and maybe it's okay to remove all names, but I'd be very uncomfortable about removing individual names except in really extreme cases, because I just think you're just opening the door to a nightmare. But the basic answer I would give is to tell the students, look, you know, the real world has all sorts of things about Woodrow Wilson and John C. Calhoun. You got to learn to live in it. Now, the university, again, should be gratuitously inflicted on people without a good reason. And I would say I would be reluctant to adopt a name on a building that I knew would have this effect. I mean, I would think I don't want to gratuitously do that, I want to unnecessarily do it. But it's already there, I'm a little reluctant to open the door to saying we have to now cleanse everything.
If I could just interject a thought on this too. There's also a great danger of sanitizing our history. The Soviets would airbrush people out of photographs when they were deemed offensive. Just to take one example, I went to Princeton. The Princeton Club here had a little sign saying "No woman allowed," dated to 1915. It was all a men's club. And then there was a movement to remove it. And it actually seemed to me a very dangerous thing to do, because it actually might be useful upon entering the club, for women entering the club and men, to see what its history was. I'm not fond of Woodrow Wilson, not fond of Calhoun's views and stuff, but to hide ourselves from the past, actually, I think could be very, very dangerous.
And also remember, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and things that Abraham Lincoln said would be horrifying today if they were said. So again, you have to start cleansing everything when you do this, and it makes me uncomfortable to do that.
Just to push back a little bit on the chilling effect for minorities of hate speech, why should the minority students be expected to sort of have a thick skin and speak up even though they might be afraid of violence against them, etc., when we're afraid of the chilling effect on people from censorship? Why can't people have a thick skin with censorship and speak up even though they're afraid of violence from the government from censorship?
Well, they should, and I'm not suggesting censorship to give people a thick skin. I'm suggesting you have to make people stronger and be willing to take those risks. That's the whole point. So the chilling effect is not saying we're going to protect you from things. It's saying, you know, be tough. Don't be afraid. Take the risk. So there's no inconsistency there. Life is not equal. Life is not fair, right? In all sorts of ways. That's unfortunate, and I do think we have to find ways to address it. I don't think censorship is an acceptable one. That's all. And I think universities should take the issue seriously, but I don't think censorship is the way to do it. Sorry.
In your interesting discussion about the possible causes of the rise of demands for censorship on the campus and so forth. You mentioned things like parental upbringing and so forth. But one thing you didn't mention, I wonder what your reaction to this is, that there's a lack of intellectual diversity on university campuses along the political dimension. That we live in a country that roughly has the same number of people who affiliate with the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, but on university campuses, the skew is quite remarkable. Jim Lindgren says that roughly 10% of law professors are Republicans and 90% are Democrats. In the social studies area, it's even more remarkable. Some people say as much as 98% of social psychologists are Democrats and virtually zero are Republicans. So does this create a kind of echo chamber problem in which people become used to hearing only certain viewpoints and then react strongly to those that are discordant? Or do you think that, and is there a fix for this that would not be worse than the cure would be worse than the disease?
So, one answer is that smart people are liberals. That's a joke. Sort of. Second, is just to justify myself, I did note that religious and political conservatives are groups who need to be attended to in terms of the notion of being like racial minorities, religious minorities, gays and lesbians in the university context. They are minorities, and they're minorities who often do feel put upon. But the answer to the question is, should universities seek diversity of ideology? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think it is unfortunate to have one ideological political perspective completely dominate for whatever reason. And part of the puzzle is why, right? Maybe it's that faculty members discriminate against people who aren't like them. I know there are people who claim that's true. I just don't have any information that would lead me to conclude it's necessarily true. In the tiny sphere that I've looked at, which is law professor applicants in elite law schools, I don't think that's the case. I think that the applicants who are conservative are as attractive to schools as those who are not conservative. But that's a tiny slice and it's not representative. But I do think that the degree of diversity in terms of achieving a greater variety of perspectives is an appropriate thing to do. It's appropriate to take it into account in hiring, in my view, in faculty, and it's appropriate to take it into account in admissions. I think I would do that. I would do both. In addition, of course, I think one of the ways you address this is by inviting speakers, very self-consciously and intentionally, who will present an unrepresented viewpoint in the institution. And that's an easy thing for universities to do, and I think a really important thing for them to do. So even if you don't have members of the faculty who take certain positions, so there'd probably be very few people on the faculty who would take the position that abortion is murder. But that's a view that almost half Americans, or roughly half Americans, hold. And to have someone to come to campus and explain that and argue it and challenge students for their assumptions otherwise, I think is a good thing to do. So yeah, I think that's one of the ways to respond to it, is by bringing in people who can present those points of view. But I think it is a problem. I agree. Yes.
Let's take one more question.
Okay, sorry. I'll leave it to Phil.
Oh, was there a question up there?
Yeah.
We can do two quick questions. How's that? Three, perhaps. How about do 3 quick questions and then there'll be one response follow-up?
I'm not going to remember all 3 questions.
You mentioned several times the slippery slope argument for a lot of your positions, and I was wondering, I guess first of all, is there a line in certain cases, and does that line necessarily moot that issue? And so an example would be, we talked about Woodrow Wilson and Calhoun. If, for example, some college opened a dorm, it was Adolf Hitler dorm, would that be an issue, just to take the extreme? And does that fact that there can be a line drawn, if you believe there could be some line drawn there, does that have any bearing on the slippery slope argument?
A simple answer is I think that university would be stupid, but it's its own business. When I became dean of the law school in Chicago back in 1987, I asked the then president of the university, what are the boundaries on naming things? Like if I have an alumnus who wants to give me a chair, right? What flexibility do I have about that, and what limits are there on it? And she said, well, give me an example. And we were then creating a public policy school. And I said, okay, suppose a donor wanted to give a public policy school to be named the Richard M. Nixon School of Public Policy Studies. And she said to me, what are you, crazy? So I do think that you want to take it, that you do take into account naming things, and Adolf Hitler would be obviously a much better example than Richard Nixon, who looks better and better every year. But at the same time, if the university wants to do that, that's its own prerogative.
Did you have a question next?
Yeah.
Okay. And then there was a guy over here, and I think that'll be it.
So my question is about the speech in the
Mic's not
classroom.
on.
Mike's not on, you gotta click.
It's fine with me. Okay.
Speak up.
Okay. So anyway, my question is about the classroom speech and the idea. I mean, discussions about about like civil rights or about like teaching sexual assault and rape unit in criminal law classes, and the idea that you brought up the Supreme Court case that talked about sort of like sometimes the more provocative the speech, the more effective it is. And so I guess what I'm wondering is in a classroom setting, should there be an effort to, because you're not really trying to be provocative as much as encourage engagement and like encourage communication, should there be an effort to present speech constructively in such a way that doesn't impact students who've been traumatized or hurt from not being able to engage in the classroom discussion?
So as I said, my view is that's basically in the discretion of the professor. And when I deal with these issues, I think through whether I want to be provocative or I don't. And there are some issues like affirmative action that I want students to take positions. I'll call on them and say, how would you argue this? Right? So it's not them telling me their own views, but if you were representing this side, what would you argue? What's the best arguments and so on? There are others where I guess I would be a little more cautious, but I don't teach criminal law, so I've never encountered the rape issue myself. In a law school setting, which is what I teach, my inclination is to basically put all that aside and to basically try to get students to deal with the most difficult positions and arguments and offensive arguments that they may ever have to encounter. Now that might be different than in college, both because the students are younger and because they're not doing law school. And I do think that a faculty member has discretion in this regard to figure out what they think is the best way to be effective as a teacher. And that will depend very much on their style and values and aspirations of the teacher.
One final question quickly.
As far as the hypothetical you gave about looking at past statements to determine whether you're going to admit somebody or going to hire somebody, is that on a very different plane than the other hypotheticals? Because anybody's hiring somebody for a job, they're going to look whether they're going to annoy everybody around them. The student, you want to see early warning signs because, freedom or not, you probably don't want to get involved in a lawsuit or something like that. Should there be less freedom there, so to speak?
Yeah, so my view is in something like an admissions decision that it is appropriate to take into account in terms of a prospective faculty member, colleagueship. Is this somebody who's going to be a good, constructive, respectful, civil colleague, or somebody who's going to be a complete jerk? Mm-hmm. And that's not the most important of the criteria, but it's a relevant one. And I think if somebody is behaving in a manner or taking positions, not because of the position substantively, by the way, but because of the way in which they're expressed, that I think that's appropriate to take into account. But it's a difficult line, because I don't think you should be deselecting faculty members or students because you don't like their views. But on the other hand, if they're expressed in ways that are immature and offensive, then I think you don't really want to look for people like that who are going to be destructive of a healthy environment. So I would think it appropriate to take it into account. So if there was a colleague I was thinking of hiring, and I knew that he alienated everybody around him because he was a jerk in any way, I would value that. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.